community and LeadWithGiants.com.
Sure, Dan, we are going live. Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome back. This is part two with Bill McGowan. In case you don't know who he is, tonight we're delighted to have him as a media guru and Emmy Award-winning correspondent, Bill McGowan. He has coached some of the biggest names in business, entertainment, including Ellie Manning, Kelly Clarkson, Jack Welch, Thomas Keller, and Kenneth Cole. He's here with us to share some of his insights from his book, Pitch Perfect. I wanted to show this to everybody. Great book. Got a great sense of humor. You got to read these stories. They're amazing, so I love it. Let's do quick introductions because we want to go around the room real quick, and let's start off with Dan Forbes.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Forbes, founder of the Lead with Giants community that you'll find on Twitter, LinkedIn, Google+, and Facebook. And our home base is LeadWithGiants.com. Glad to be with you here on the show, Bill. Tal, always great to see you. And Liz, good to see you again. I'm in Sarasota, Florida, by the way.
Lucky you.
Yes.
He hasn't had much of a
Somebody
winter.
has to live here.
He hasn't had much of winter. I bought him a ticket for Alaska.
We don't
so
do
hopefully, or New York for that matter. How is the weather in New York, Bill?
It's cold and drizzly.
All
We
right.
have not gotten spring yet.
All right. We'll send Dan just right after the show. But Liz, go right ahead. I'm sorry. Introduce yourself.
I'm Liz Stinselli in Salt Lake City, Utah, waiting for spring here also. And I'm with Stinselli Advisors and happy to be with you guys tonight.
Excellent. Excellent. And last but not least, Bill McGowan.
I am coming to you from just outside New York City, and I am the founder and CEO of Clarity Media Group, which is a communications coaching firm based in New York, California, and Singapore.
So, Bill, you kind of sort of got into the coaching aspect of several years of being an interviewer and doing a lot of producing and writing. What was that moment felt like, that aha moment that you felt like? Did you know it's going to take you where you are today?
No. Like most ideas that you look back on and think, boy, that was a really good idea. It wasn't mine. I have a woman to thank who I was interviewing for a video I was producing for her. And after we were done with her sit-down interview, she asked if she could take a look at the video right then and there and get a sense of how she did. And my initial reaction was, you know, this doesn't sound like it's going to fit into my shooting schedule. I'm not sure I want to do this. And but she was the client, so we set it up and we started viewing the videotape. And you know, I guess every 2 or 3 minutes, I would say, you know, you probably don't want to start your answer with something like that. It's a little off the mark and people lose their engagement. Why don't you lead with this idea? And after about 10 minutes, she turned to me and said, this is what you should be doing. You know, you're perfect. I'm sure you're a perfectly fine producer and everything, but there's a real value in this kind of coaching, and I think you're particularly, you know, good at it. So it was her idea, and I've given her thanks and credit over many, many years for that.
How did you feel at that moment? Was that just you needed to go back home and reflect upon it, or you knew this is something you want to pursue?
Well, I did reflect on it, but I had already spent 20-plus years in television. I produced and reported over 700 long-form TV news magazine segments, so I was ready for a new challenge anyway, and this sounded like a really interesting idea, the fact that I could reach over the line to the person who I was interviewing and actually tell them how they were sabotaging themselves.
Right,
From a
right.
communication standpoint, when I was a journalist, of course, that wasn't my job. You know, I wasn't there to coach them or aid them in any way. So this was a very interesting twist on the whole equation.
Great, great. So one of the paths that you've taken and came across, you share a moment of vulnerability, really, as you got the Facebook account.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about that, because the reason I want to ask you about that is because it's interesting how we communicate today on Twitter and social media or texting have changed the course of that whole account for you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I had basically been successful in winning a bake-off with 4 or 5 other media training firms to get this Facebook account. And to make the story concise for our time, instead of going to the address I had in Palo Alto, California, I went to that address in San Francisco, which is a good hour away in morning rush hour traffic.
Yes.
I went to the wrong city, basically.
Yes.
And when I showed up at the address, it was not Facebook, it was a nail salon. And in the height of my denial, I actually thought, well, maybe it's above the nail salon. You know, I was just so panicky at that point. And I had heard on the phone when I was trying to make arrangements to get down there that I better get there quick because the woman who had hired me was out of her mind livid. And so I decided, all right, this is really going to test my own communication skills. I have to say, I'm sorry for this, get it behind us, so the entire day isn't poisoned. And so I initially sent her a text. I decided, let's vent on texting first. And I said, absolutely right, this is a terrible way to start. It's all on me, inexcusable. All I can tell you is, once I get there, we're going to have an amazing day. So she let forth her frustration, and then by the time I got there, she was the picture of professionalism. All the toxicity had been kind of purged, and we got on, you know, to do the business at hand. So sometimes when you say you're sorry, you shouldn't justify it or qualify it or try to blame somebody else for it going wrong. Just fall on your sword and own it.
Right.
And I think you get it past you a lot faster.
Right, and you get your credibility back, and that was something that I think that was key. So thank you for sharing that. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Did you?
And then at the same time, one of the other key components is try to get them to visualize an eventual great outcome.
Right.
Reassure them, you know, even if your own confidence is shaken, that this is going to be great once we get past this.
Right, right. You're willing to be humble and admit that something went wrong, and you're willing to make it right.
Right.
And you know, they ended up in this book, so it's got to speak for something. So.
But on the way down there, believe me, I actually was this close to saying to the cab driver, you know, just take me to the airport. I really don't think I can like pull myself out of this thing. I think it's pretty hopeless.
Right. Well, it turned out it paid off for you, and it's a great story.
Hey,
So,
Tal, that reminds me of the email I sent you earlier today that said you get to be the first person today to hear me say I was wrong.
right, right.
Email.
It's a tough thing for all of us to say.
I think it is, and I say moment of vulnerability because most of us, when we look at, you know, TV producers and people who are out there in the news, they think that they're just, everything is going well, and you know, there's no mistakes and nobody did anything wrong. So it's a moment of vulnerability for someone as yourself who got into the coaching aspect of it and maybe started kind of on a rough patch there, but then you made it up and it was worthwhile for you. So I think that was a great story. Yeah. So. Let me go over to our panel now, and Dan, go ahead. I know you've got a question.
Yeah, so I was recently at a corporate training event, and one of the senior corporate members was there, and they were doing the opening speech and the ending speech the next day. You know, the opening speech, it was laced with profanity to make points. And I'm looking around my table and I'm saying, really? I mean, does the guy have to speak like that?
Right.
And, you know, I found it very offensive.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody, it didn't seem to bother anybody else. The next day, when it was the last session, and I had actually gone to the wrong room at the hotel, meeting room, and so I was like late coming in by just a few minutes, and I walked through the door and he's up there talking, and the first thing I hear again is profanity. And I just turned around and walked out.
Yeah.
I said, you know, I'm just not going to listen to it. So, you know, obviously that's wrong. But, you know, what do you say to clients to get a point across that they shouldn't be doing that? What do you tell your clients?
My point to them, you know, I try not to make it about swear or don't swear. I try not to make it about my moral position on it. What I try to do is let them know strategically why this is a bad decision. Mm-hmm. And probably what I would say to that client is, so what do you want them leaving the room thinking? You know, when they look back on your speech a week from now, what do you want them remembering? Do you want them remembering that you dropped the F-bomb 20 times? Or do you want them to remember that you had a visionary idea, that you challenged them to think differently about something? And I try to make the swearing tantamount to the ultimate distraction, that it is actually a tool that's going to work against you in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what am I talking about, right?
Yeah.
So what did I take away from that opening session or the closing session? I have no idea what he said other than how that made me feel, and I've told that story to several people now instead of telling the story he probably wish I was telling.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just an insane choice for somebody to make. Because also, if your audience develops a dislike or a discomfort for what you're doing up there, they're not going to be receptive to your ideas. So you're basically shutting the audience off.
Right. Thank you.
Great question. Let's go over to Liz. You've got a question for Bill?
Sure. Bill, so if you could, I'm sure there are many things, but if you could say what would be your top thing that would undermine someone's ability to have a persuasive conversation with someone, what would that one top thing be?
There's a communication trait in the book that I call verbal backspacing. And what I mean by that is somebody who is trying to talk in a very linear way and to keep the conversation moving forward, but they're constantly second-guessing themselves, that the last thing they said wasn't perfect. So instead of moving forward with the conversation, they hit the backspace button and they restate what they said 3 or 4 or 5 seconds ago to try to make it absolutely perfect, or to find just the right way of saying it because their own self-doubt has made them think that it wasn't good enough. So I find that this communication style makes you seem very uncertain of yourself. It really strips your conviction, and I think it shakes the confidence of the person on the receiving end. You have to really keep in mind that nobody besides you has any idea that what just came out of your mouth wasn't the ideal way you meant to say it. Only you know that. So you're almost exposing a mistake to the audience that they would otherwise not have known about. So my strategy with clients, and the one I put forth in the book, is the first way you say it is the best way to say it.
Good to know. Very, very good to know. Thank you.
My pleasure.
That's great. So I should not. So whatever I say to Dan, probably whatever kind of came out. That's.
You know what came to my mind was saying, "Fool me once, shame on me. You fool me twice." You know, the George Bush moment when he flubbed that line. I mean, everybody knew that it was wrong and it was flubbed.
Right.
But you know, so what do you do? How do you get by those type of things?
I think what he should have said was, you know what I mean.
Exactly.
You know,
yeah.
If you make a mistake, don't look thrown by it. Right.
Yeah.
The only time people in the audience get tense for you is if you seem tense over the mistake.
Absolutely.
And it's very hard to do, to just sort of, brush it off.
Yeah, easier said than done.
Very much easier said than done, but it's something that you really need to work on. And one other thing that I just want to point out, when you rehearse a speech, a presentation, whatever it is, don't get in the habit of stopping the first time you make a mistake and starting all over again. You need to develop the skill and the talent of, how do I pull myself out of this nosedive when things are going poorly? And if I don't perfect that skill in rehearsal, I am never going to be able to do it live in front of an audience.
Right. Bill, I want to ask you about charisma, body language. How does that all play into some of the coaching you're working with, and how important that is to doing a presentation or just public speaking, and talk to us about a little bit about that.
The charisma factor is all about trying to make sure the audience is 100% convinced that you are loving being up there, that you've looked forward all week to this opportunity to talk to them. Even if you don't feel that way in your heart, you have to fake it until you can get to the point where you really are enjoying the opportunity to be up in front of a group of people. So most people, in their tension and in their anxiety of making sure they don't make a mistake of any kind, they come out very flat and very serious in their facial expression. And they look like, you know, somebody's asked them to go to the dentist for oral surgery. You really want to try to exude a sense of joy in doing this. And your definition of success should not be the absence of a stutter or a stumble or some misspeaking of some kind. That perfection is not what you're after. What you're after is displaying genuine enthusiasm for the value of the information I'm up here sharing with you. That's your definition of success. If you can really put your back into it and convince the audience by example, this is important to know. This is going to be beneficial to you. Who cares if you stumble a couple times or you flub a word? That's not what people are going to remember. And if you flatten out to play it safe so you can technically get through the thing clean, you're pursuing the wrong goal.
It reminds me of a message of John Maxwell by saying that people don't buy into the vision unless they buy into the person. So
right.
Just as important as your character and how you carry yourself and whether you're really passionate about or enthusiastic, as you say, that's how they're going to believe. But if somebody just sits there and really not enthusiastic and kind of boring about it, then people are not going to buy into it. Last question I do want to ask you with a little bit of inspiration from you in terms of who was, in your opinion, or maybe one or two people that you look up to as a public speaker, and why do they have such great communication skills?
Well, I think I mentioned earlier, I mentioned Jeff Bezos, I mentioned Sheryl Sandberg, and I really like the speaking style of the Pepsi CEO. Her name right now escapes me. But they're people who seem like they are really loving the opportunity to be able to communicate to people who use their product. Right. And one of the greatest appearances I ever saw was Jeff Bezos on Martha Stewart years ago introducing the Kindle. And now, Jeff Bezos has a lot of technical knowledge. He's an incredibly bright guy. But sitting in that studio, which basically is Martha Stewart's kitchen replica, he was able to talk to her in a way that wasn't condescending, but it was very consumer friendly. And there wasn't a hint of jargon, inside tech language. It was like he was showing his mom how to use a new gift that he gave her. And I thought, wow, this is a guy who really gets the whole notion of adapting your content and your style for the audience that you're speaking to. One size does not fit all.
And I agree with that. I think that when people show their human side of who they are, because I think a lot of our communication goes back to trust, and so there's a great way to communicate how you can trust someone because they're not just putting on all this show and all that, because who they are as especially someone like that, right?
Right, absolutely.
Great. Well, let's conclude here, and we had a great time with you, Bill. Thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it talking to all three of you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, and our audience can actually view this after we record this, and we'll have an opportunity for people to dive into our conversation on their own time as well.
That would
Let
be
me
great.
go ahead and close off. Does anybody else has any closing remarks?
I hope people will join us in the Lead with Giants community. They can connect at leadwithgiants.com. Thank you, Bill. Good to be with you this evening. Liz,
And I enjoyed it.
Thank
always
you.
fantastic.
Just one last note, Bill, give us or our audience your website that they can go into and read your blog and some other resources that they can actually develop themselves in their communication.
Great. And I'll be updating this blog and my newsletter on a regular basis with some of these tips that I find come out of real media training sessions day in and day out. It's at bepitchperfect.com. That's bepitchperfect.com.
Great. And this is the book, just in case anybody has seen it. It's a great read and great many ideas. I'm a student of communication, and it's great to learn from you, Bill.
Tal, thank you very much. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.